Elliot Blackwood is a powerful and successful CEO, known for his ruthless nature in business and his controlling ways. The very essence of dominance runs through his veins, making it impossible for him to let anyone challenge his authority, whether in the workplace or in his personal life. Elliot has always kept things simple. Relationships were either fleeting or transactional. He never believed in love, it was something that could be used against him. Then there was James Moore, a young, free-spirited artist who had recently entered Elliot's world as a potential project partner for an art initiative. Their first meeting was casual, yet James couldn't deny the magnetic pull he felt towards Elliot. Unlike the men he usually dated, Elliot exuded an aura of control and confidence that both intimidated and intrigued him. Despite the tension, James kept his distance, not wanting to complicate the professional relationship. But as weeks passed, their encounters became more frequent, and their unspoken connection simmered beneath the surface. James found himself drawn to Elliot's charm, and while Elliot tried to maintain his usual cold, detached demeanor, something about James softened him in ways he couldn't explain. Still, both men kept their desires locked away, wary of letting anything ruin their professional relationship. One evening, after an art gala where James had showcased some of his recent work, the two of them ended up alone at a private afterparty. The alcohol flowed, and their usual guardedness began to fade. In a private corner of the room, James found himself caught up in a conversation with a charming guest, someone who seemed to pay him more attention than he was used to. Flattered and a little tipsy, James allowed the flirtation to escalate into a kiss. In that fleeting moment, he felt a thrill of excitement, something new and refreshing, but when the kiss deepened, he felt the unmistakable presence of someone looming behind him. Elliot had entered the room unnoticed. He watched as James kissed another man, a flash of anger sparking in his chest. His jaw clenched, his fists tightening as he saw his artist, give himself to someone else. For the first time in his life, Elliot felt something he couldn't control, jealousy. It was a feeling he had never welcomed, but it consumed him in that instant. He couldn't let James slip away. Not like this. Not to someone else. Without a word, Elliot approached them. His presence alone froze the air in the room. James, caught off guard, pulled away from the other man. Before he could say anything, Elliot stepped forward, gripped his wrist, and with a swift motion, pulled him away from the man and the party. It was like he had taken control of the entire room, and for a moment, James felt like a puppet on a string. The moment they were outside, in the cool night air, Elliot didn't speak immediately. He just stared at James, his piercing gaze filled with a storm of emotion. James tried to speak, to apologize, but his words died in his throat as he saw the fire burning in Elliot's eyes. "You think you can just kiss someone else in front of me?" Elliot's voice was calm but icy, dangerous. There was no room for argument, no room for escape. "It wasn't like that," James tried to explain, his heart racing. He didn't understand why Elliot's reaction had such a profound effect on him. But there was something about the way Elliot was looking at him, a deep possessiveness that made his body go still, his mind clouded. Elliot stepped closer, crowding James, forcing him to step back until his back was pressed against the brick wall of the building. Elliot's face was inches from his, their breaths mingling. James could feel the heat radiating off of him, the intensity in the air making him lightheaded. There was no escaping it now. Elliot wasn't just angry. He was claiming him. "I don't share, James," Elliot whispered, his hand moving to grip James' jaw with surprising gentleness. "You belong to me. Only me." James was stunned. The words hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment, he didn't know how to react. A part of him felt suffocated, trapped by Elliot's dominant, possessive nature. Another part of him, a deeper, darker part, felt a thrill he had never known before. He had always been independent, always in control of his emotions, but with Elliot, everything was different. The power that emanated from him was intoxicating, and James could feel himself drawn in, unable to break free. "You don't own me," James finally said, though his voice trembled. "I'm not some possession." Elliot's eyes darkened at the defiance. He had never been one to tolerate resistance, especially from someone he wanted so badly. He stepped even closer, his lips brushing against James' ear as he spoke. "You're mine, whether you accept it or not." The tension between them continued to build. In the days that followed, Elliot kept his distance in public, maintaining his cold, composed facade. But privately, he couldn't stop thinking about James, about the kiss, about the way he had reacted. He wasn't used to feeling out of control, and the jealousy had stirred something in him that he couldn't ignore. James, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that Elliot was always watching him, always waiting for him to make a misstep. He was torn between wanting to fight for his own freedom and wanting to succumb to the dark, possessive force that Elliot was. Each time they met, the pull between them grew stronger. One evening, Elliot invited James to his penthouse, his space, his domain. There, things escalated. The moment they were alone, Elliot took control once more. His touch was demanding, possessive, and James realized that he wasn't sure he wanted to resist anymore. "You belong to me, James. No one else. Do you understand?" Elliot whispered, his voice low and commanding. James couldn't answer with words. Instead, he kissed him back, a surrender of everything he had fought against. Elliot paced the length of his penthouse, his mind torn between anger and desire. James sat stiffly on the leather couch, unsure whether to leave or stay, his heart thundering in his chest. The silence between them was oppressive, charged with unspoken words and emotions. Elliot finally stopped, turning to James with eyes that burned. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" His voice was low, dangerously quiet. "I've never let anyone get under my skin, and yet here you are, making me feel like I could lose control of everything." James swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to. I didn't think I mattered that much to you." Elliot's laugh was humorless as he stalked toward him. "Not matter to me?" He gripped the back of the couch, leaning over James. "You've mattered to me since the moment I saw you. And the fact that you can't see it infuriates me." James felt the heat of Elliot's presence, the weight of his words sinking into him. He tried to look away, but Elliot's hand caught his chin, forcing their eyes to meet. The intensity in Elliot's gaze made him shiver. "When I saw you with him," Elliot continued, his voice rough, "it took everything in me not to break him apart right there. Do you understand? You're mine, James. And I don't share." James's breath hitched at the raw possessiveness in Elliot's tone. He should have felt smothered, afraid even, but instead, he felt his body betraying him. Heat coursed through him, a dark thrill he couldn't deny. "Elliot," he began, but the words died on his lips as Elliot pressed a finger against them. "No excuses," Elliot said firmly. "I don't want apologies. I want to know if you're ready to stop fighting me." Elliot didn't wait for an answer. His lips were on James's in an instant, consuming him with a passion that left no room for hesitation. It wasn't gentle, nor was it kind. It was a claim, a declaration of ownership that left James gasping for air. His hands moved instinctively to Elliot's chest, unsure whether to push him away or pull him closer. "I've waited long enough," Elliot growled against James's lips. "You've been driving me insane, pretending you don't feel this. But I see it in your eyes. You want me just as much as I want you." James's resistance crumbled as Elliot's hands slid around his waist, pulling him flush against his hard body. The kiss deepened, and James found himself surrendering completely, his body melting under Elliot's touch. For the first time, he allowed himself to let go, to feel what it meant to be wanted so fiercely. "You're not leaving tonight," Elliot whispered against his neck, his voice dark and commanding. "You're staying here, where I can keep you close. Where I can remind you who you belong to." James's heart raced, but he nodded, his voice failing him. There was no denying it now, he was completely at Elliot's mercy, and he didn't want it any other way. That night, Elliot showed James just how far his possessiveness would go. Every touch, every kiss, was a reminder that James was his. Elliot's hands roamed his body with purpose, mapping every inch as if to ensure no one else could ever claim him. His words were low and rough, whispered against James's skin like a mantra, "You're mine. Only mine. Say it." James gasped, his body trembling under Elliot's control. "I'm yours," he whispered, the words slipping out like a confession. "I've always been yours." The admission broke something inside Elliot, unleashing a side of him he had kept hidden for so long. He worshipped James with a fierce intensity, his lips and hands never ceasing their exploration. Every sound James made only fueled him further, and the walls Elliot had built around his emotions began to crumble. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel everything, to embrace the vulnerability of wanting someone so completely. By the time the night was over, James lay tangled in Elliot's arms, his body exhausted but his mind alight. He had never felt anything like this before, this raw, all-consuming connection that left him both terrified and exhilarated. He turned to look at Elliot, who was watching him with a quiet intensity. "You scare me," James admitted softly. Elliot's hand traced lazy circles on his back. "Good," he replied. "Because you terrify me too." As days passed, their relationship deepened, but so did the challenges. Elliot's possessiveness didn't wane, and while James loved the passion that came with it, he began to wonder how much of himself he was willing to give up. Elliot's need for control extended beyond the bedroom, and James struggled to assert his independence without triggering Elliot's jealousy. One evening, when James decided to go out with friends, Elliot's reaction was immediate and fierce. "You didn't tell me you were going out," Elliot said coldly when James mentioned his plans. "I didn't realize I needed your permission," James shot back, frustration flaring. "I'm not a prisoner, Elliot." Elliot's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening. "You're not a prisoner, but you're mine. And I don't like the idea of you out there with other people who might think they can take what's mine." "I'm not going to run off with someone else," James said, softening his tone. "But you have to trust me." Elliot stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he stepped closer, his hands gripping James's waist. "It's not about trust," he murmured. "It's about knowing that I'd destroy anyone who tried to take you from me." James shivered at the intensity of Elliot's words, both afraid of and drawn to the darkness in him. He knew being with Elliot wouldn't be easy, but the passion between them was undeniable. And despite the challenges, James realized he didn't want to let Elliot go. The days following James's defiance were strained. Elliot remained distant, his silence heavier than any argument they could have had. James felt trapped between his own independence and the magnetic pull of Elliot's possessive love. He knew Elliot wasn't trying to hurt him, but his intensity was overwhelming. The tension finally broke during a dinner at Elliot's penthouse. James had come over to talk things through, but the conversation had devolved into sharp words and heated accusations. "You're suffocating me, Elliot," James snapped, standing by the window that overlooked the city. "You say you love me, but it feels more like you're trying to own me." Elliot, sitting at the head of the long dining table, looked at him with a calmness that was more dangerous than shouting. "I'm trying to protect you, James. Do you know how many people would love to take advantage of someone like you? Someone who's too kind, too trusting." James crossed his arms, frustration bubbling over. "And what about trusting me? I'm not some fragile thing that needs guarding all the time." Elliot stood, his movements slow and deliberate as he crossed the room to stand in front of James. He reached out, his hand curling gently around the back of James's neck. "You don't understand what you mean to me," Elliot murmured, his voice low and intense. "You're not fragile, James. You're the only thing in my life that feels real. And the thought of losing you, of someone else touching you." His voice trailed off, but his grip tightened just enough to make James shiver. "It would destroy me." James's breath hitched at the raw vulnerability in Elliot's words. He hated how easily Elliot's touch could unravel him, how the weight of his presence made him feel both trapped and safe at the same time. "Elliot," James whispered, his voice trembling. "I need more than this. I need to feel like I'm not just a part of your world, I need to feel like we're equals. Elliot studied him for a long moment before stepping closer, his other hand resting on James's waist. I don't know how to do that, he admitted, his voice softer now. But I'll try. If you'll stay. James looked up at him, searching his eyes for the truth in his words. And for the first time, he saw the cracks in Elliot's armor, the fear, the desperation, and the love that Elliot struggled to express. That night, something shifted between them. Elliot made good on his promise to try, starting with letting James take the lead. It was a slow, tentative process, but one that deepened their connection in ways James hadn't expected. In the bedroom, Elliot's usual dominance softened. He let James guide their movements, his hands steady but uncharacteristically patient. James took his time, running his hands over Elliot's chest, exploring the hard lines of his body with reverence. You're always in control, James murmured as he kissed the hollow of Elliot's throat, his lips trailing down to his chest. But tonight, let me take care of you. Elliot's hands gripped the sheets beneath him, his body taut with restraint. He wasn't used to surrendering, but the way James touched him, so careful, so deliberate, made it impossible to resist. You're dangerous, Elliot rasped as James's lips pressed against his stomach. You make me feel things I've spent years trying to bury. James smiled against his skin, his fingers tracing the waistband of Elliot's trousers. Good. Maybe it's time you stopped hiding. The intimacy between them was raw and unguarded, their usual power dynamic slipping away as they explored each other in a way that felt more equal, more vulnerable. By the time the night was over, Elliot was left speechless, his walls completely shattered. But peace between them didn't last long. Elliot's possessiveness reared its head again when James decided to attend another gala, this time without Elliot. I told you I'd meet you there, Elliot said, his voice clipped as James adjusted his cufflinks in the mirror. I know, James replied, trying to keep his tone calm. But I want to go early and spend some time with friends. Elliot stepped closer, his gaze narrowing. Friends, or someone you think I wouldn't approve of? James turned to face him, exasperation evident on his face. You can't keep doing this, Elliot. You can't keep assuming that every person I talk to is some kind of threat. Elliot's jaw tightened, his eyes dark with barely contained jealousy. I don't trust them, James. You're too important to me to let anyone else get close. And what about trusting me? James shot back. I chose you, Elliot. Isn't that enough? The argument ended with James walking out the door, leaving Elliot alone in his penthouse. When James arrived at the gala, he tried to shake off the tension from their fight. But as the night wore on, he couldn't stop glancing at the door, half expecting Elliot to show up. And show up he did. Elliot entered the room like a storm, his presence commanding attention from everyone around him. His eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on James, who was deep in conversation with another man. In an instant, Elliot was at his side, his hand possessively resting on the small of James's back. The man James had been talking to quickly excused himself, sensing the tension. I told you I'd meet you here, Elliot said, his voice low but firm. James sighed, turning to face him. Elliot, this has to stop. You can't keep acting like this every time I talk to someone else. Elliot leaned in, his lips brushing against James's ear. You don't understand, do you? I can't stop. Not when it comes to you. James shivered at the dark intensity in Elliot's voice, his resolve wavering. He hated how easily Elliot could unravel him, how the possessive heat in his gaze made him feel both furious and weak. But as Elliot's hand tightened on his waist, pulling him closer, James realized that fighting him was useless. He wasn't just Elliot's obsession, he was his addiction. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. The fight simmered beneath the surface for days, neither of them addressing the tension that had thickened between them after the gala. James stayed at his own apartment for a few nights, hoping the distance would cool Elliot's possessiveness and give him space to think. But Elliot wasn't a man who waited. One rainy evening, James heard a knock on his door. He hesitated, knowing who it would be, before finally opening it to find Elliot standing there, soaked from the rain. His usually composed demeanor was gone, replaced with raw vulnerability. "I can't do this anymore, James," Elliot said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I can't keep pretending I'm okay when you're not with me." James sighed, shutting the door behind him. "Elliot, we can't keep going in circles. I love you, but this obsession, it's suffocating me." Elliot's eyes darkened. "You don't understand. I don't know how to love any other way. You're everything to me, James. Without you, I'm nothing." James felt his heart ache at the desperation in Elliot's voice, but he knew he couldn't keep letting Elliot's fears control their relationship. "I don't need you to be perfect, Elliot," he said softly. "I just need you to trust me. To trust that I'll stay because I love you, not because you're holding on so tight I can't leave." Elliot looked at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I don't know if I can change overnight," he admitted. "But I'll try. For you, I'll try." The weeks that followed were a delicate balancing act. Elliot fought his instincts to control, and James worked to reassure him that he wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't easy, there were arguments, moments when Elliot's possessiveness flared up again, but they both fought to make it work. One evening, as they lay together in Elliot's bed, James traced lazy patterns on his chest. "Do you ever regret letting me in?" he asked, his voice quiet. Elliot turned to him, his hand brushing a strand of hair from James's face. "Never," he said firmly. "You're the only thing in my life that makes me feel human." James smiled, leaning in to kiss him softly. "Then let's keep trying. Together." Months later, James stood on the balcony of Elliot's penthouse, watching the city lights twinkle below. Elliot joined him, wrapping his arms around James's waist from behind. "You've changed me," Elliot murmured against his ear. "I didn't think it was possible, but you've made me better." James leaned back against him, a contented smile on his face. "And you've shown me what it means to be truly loved." It hadn't been an easy journey, but together they had found a way to balance Elliot's intensity with James's need for independence. Their love wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs. And for both of them, that was enough.